our recent study, and I know you've worked on this democracy issue, which I truly appreciate. A recent study by Northwestern predicted that 1/3 of the U.S. newspapers that existed roughly 2 decades ago will be gone by 2025. The bill that Senator Kennedy and I have, the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, would allow local news organizations to negotiate with online platforms, including generative AI platforms. This bill passed through this committee now twice. Could you describe how Adobe approaches this issue? And in your experience, is it possible to train sophisticated generative AI models without using copyrighted materials absent consent?
Thank you for the question. Absolutely. Our current model that is out there is trained using the licensed content that I had mentioned before, and other content that has no restrictions on it, and it comes from the right holders directly. So we definitely think it is possible. We've done it. It's out there on our website, and it's also in Photoshop, and people love it. The creative professionals are using that AI. It makes their day easy. It lets them start their creative work in just one click, and then they finish it in the tool. So it's really revolutionized how we think about things in terms of how we acquire data sets. We have a group inside Adobe who that's their job. Their job is to think about, where do we need to go next? Do we need to get to different media types? Are we missing some sort of subject matter for our AI to be more accurate? That was the question we had before. We think about that content. Maybe there's a newspaper that you mentioned that has the kind of content we need. We go approach that organization and say, look, we need to license that content in to make sure our AI is more accurate. So we have a team that thinks about this, sources it, and brings it in.
And in the absence of that, I mean, what impacts do you anticipate this could have on local journalism if there's no rules of the road put in place?
Yeah, I think that, both on the authenticity side and on this side, if people are able to, create images and these newspapers are not able to get, the ability to license the work they're doing, it could certainly have a negative impact to them. On the authenticity side, the reason why so many media companies have joined the Content Authenticity Initiative, like AP, Reuters, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, is because they know that when they're showing images, they need to be able to show that they're actually true. They need to be able to prove that it happened. If people stop believing that any of the digital images they're seeing are real, then they're going to stop consuming newspapers. They're going to stop consuming that content because they're not going to believe it. So you have to give those local newspapers a way to prove what they're showing is true, so people will still consume it.
Of course, there's a lot less famous newspapers, including some very small ones in my state that just you might not mention, right? And so I think that's part of it, is that the Ms. Ortizes of the story need to be able to have some kind of power to be able to protect their content too, because they don't have a general counsel and they're not going to be able to, on their own, start some major lawsuit. And so I think that's how we have to think about that too, as we look at all of this.
And that's why I would say again that when we designed the Firefly, we designed it that way, right? To be commercially safe first, right? Making sure that we built the model the way.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I'm saying it sort of rhetorically to the world and to everyone that needs to get this done, as opposed to you, Mr. Rao. So thank you
so much.
All right, appreciate it. And thank you, both of you, for your continual bipartisan work in taking on this very important issue. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. We're going to do a last round of questioning. We may be joined by other colleagues, but we are also in the middle of a vote. So my hunch is we will resolve this in 10 to 15 minutes at the most, if I might. I'm interested in pursuing the question of a federal statutory right of publicity. And to me, the core issue really is what's the remedy? Often preemption is motivated by a desire for there to be consistency, the elevation in terms of process and access to justice and potential remedies that comes with a federal right as opposed to a state right. But Professor, if I could start with you, you testified earlier in response to a question from Senator Blackburn that commercial replacement is not the appropriate test under current fair use law in the United States. Should we adopt a federal right of publicity with commercial replacement as the test or a part of the test, and how would that play out? What other remedy might you suggest under a new federal right of publicity?
Senator, thank you for that question, because I was quite alarmed by some of the discourse here about right of publicity. I think
I'm alarmed regularly by discourse in the Senate.
As well as thinking about publicity rights for well-known artists, musicians, etc., Congress should be thinking about the right of publicity of ordinary people, people who are anonymous, people who have no commercially valuable reputation. All of us deserve to be protected from deepfakes and synthetic reproductions of our name, image, and likeness, regardless of whether we're a famous politician or a famous artist or just an anonymous law professor. So I think...
How would you focus the remedy in order to make that effective?
Senator, in terms of remedy, I think that right of publicity statutes have traditionally had injunctive relief, usually incorporating the equitable balancing test. That is the remedy I would go for, which would mean that models might have to be retrained.
Injunctive relief only, not commercial penalties?
Damages potential as well. But statutory damages, I don't think so. Statutory damages can be quite distorting. They tend to be a honeypot for opportunistic lawyers, as well as genuinely aggrieved plaintiffs. So I would steer clear of statutory damages, but actual damage and injunctions, absolutely.
Mr. Rao, I'd be interested in your views on what a right of publicity might potentially do. I'd also be interested in hearing your thoughts on how we should be trying to balance respecting copyright through this or other means while incentivizing investment in AI and accelerating innovation in the United States.
Thank you for the question. So we talked about in our testimony similar to, but not exactly like a right of publicity. We've referred to as a federal anti-impersonation right. And the reason we thought about it from an anti-impersonation perspective is actually some of the same questions Professor Sag raised, which is we want to make sure Professor Sag himself does not have a deepfake made of him. So if you think about it as an impersonation right, that would apply to everybody. And what we're really targeting there is we see the economic displacement that we've been talking about here, where an AI is trained on an artist and creates an output that is exactly like the artist, and they're getting displaced by that work. And copyright may not reach them. Like, that's been the question. So that's why we believe they do need this right, so they can go after these people who are impersonating work, whether that's likeness, whether that's style. And then the test would be something that we'd work out through 6 months of deliberation here in this body, exactly how you would decide that. But I think that's the right approach, because you want to focus on people who are intentionally impersonating someone in order to get some commercial benefit. And I think that will help clarify what harm we're trying to address.
Mr. Brooks, how do you think a federal anti-impersonation right?
By the way, that spells fair. Just want to make that clear. I know how Congress loves acronyms, yeah?
We are enthusiastic about acronyms. We actually are producing a Senate-only version of ChatGPT that only produces acronyms for bill names. Mr. Brooks, how do you think a federal publicity right or an anti-impersonation right, a federal requirement that there be opt-in only rather than opt-out, would impact the business model that you're currently representing?
So, Chair Coons, I think the actual instrument and the content of that instrument, I think we're relatively agnostic at this stage. As I said to Senator Klobuchar, it is important from our perspective that there are clear rules governing the use of likeness in an improper way. I think the important thing to stress there is that it is a use. And to some extent, we can't escape the fact that the determination of whether it's proper or improper will depend on the application, what the user does or does not do with that content downstream. So as I say, you know, from our perspective, the lines in the sand between improper use of likeness, free experimentation with style, or other kinds of good or bad use of these tools aren't easy to draw. They're very fact sensitive. It may be appropriate for courts to determine that. But at a high level, as I say, I think there is a core of things around that improper use of likeness, especially voice likeness, that there may be some legislative intervention there that makes sense and may have obligations, as I say, across the supply chain, across the ecosystem.
Mr. Halston, if I might, the Copyright Office recently issued guidance about human authorship being critical to any copyright protection. Is their guidance accessible enough, relevant? Did they strike the right balance? Should we be looking at a different policy in terms of how broadly copyright protection should reach when there is AI-assisted creativity as opposed to AI-generated?
I think the Copyright Office did a pretty good job. One can debate whether an AI component in a broader work should also be afforded some form of copyright. I think they landed in the right place, that it shouldn't. That copyright should only be afforded to human creation. So, for example, if you had an AI generated song, well, if you had a song that was created by an artist and they used a piece of it was generative AI, there could be a copyright in that entire work, but the AI generated portion would not be protectable. So if someone were to actually sample it or to lift it out and use it in another context, it would not be subject to copyright. I think they did a pretty good job trying to strike that balance.
In the conversation I had previously with Professor Sag, how do you feel about the scope of potential remedies if we were to craft an anti-impersonation statute?
I'm glad you asked me that question.
I thought you would.
Thank you. I think there should be a private right of action. I think that I think commerciality is, again, not always the proper standard here. I think that in some instances we've had artists who've had been victim of deep fakes where the voice was appropriated and the lyric content was something the artist would never have said. And that's something that can have irreparable harm to their career and trying to explain what, that it wasn't them. Because this stuff is really good. Some of these AI generated things are really good.
Ms. Ortiz, last but not least, has in producing some of the interesting, engaging, powerful, inspiring content you've generated, have you ever relied on an AI tool to help you expand or produce some of the works you've worked on? And what is your hope about what we might do going forward here in Congress in response to what we've heard from you about your concerns today?
I'm very happy you asked this question, Senator. So I have never really, I was curious very early on before I knew the extent of the exploitation of artists, very briefly used an AI to generate references, and I didn't enjoy it at all. I love every step of the process of being an artist. And ever since I found out, last August, September, of what actually went behind the scenes, I cannot use it. My peers refuse to use it. My industry is very clear that we do not want to exploit each other. And again, it's important to remember that these, models basically compete in our own markets. And this isn't something that's hypothetical. It has happened now with our own works. And one of the things that I would hope, would be kind of addressed here is that a lot of the solutions that have been proposed, or, basically you cannot enact them unless you know what's in the data set. And for this, we need to ensure that there's clear transparency built from ground up. Like, no offense to some of the companies here, but if you don't know what exactly is in the data set, how do we know? How does the licensor know that my work is in the data set? And that, I feel like, it's one of the starting foundations for artists and other individuals as well to be able to gain consent, credit, and compensation. Thank you.
Mr. Tillerson, before I just hand it over to you and then we're going to conclude, I just appreciate all of you taking the time and effort and helping educate us. You are literally training us as we try to produce some fidelity in our legislating work. Senator Tillerson.
Yeah, to me, trying to figure out what may or may not be in the language model is a lot like taking roll in a dark classroom. I just don't understand how you would do it. So, I can see that we have to work at it. But I want to start, Mr. Brooks, by thanking you for being here. I think that anyone that's watching this needs to understand that this isn't unique to Stability AI. This is a broader set of issues that we have to deal with. And I appreciate the fact that you'd be willing to come here because you should expect that some of the concerns are that were going to be expressed to begin with. I have one question. The bad news for you all is that my staff are really excited about this. These are the questions that that we're going to submit for the record, but rather than expect you all to respond to every one of them, you're welcome to do that. Your area of expertise, your priorities, just use that to guide you and get that information back for the record. But one of the ones I won't have to ask, because we ask it now, is a recent survey on how consumers view AI found that most consumers, nearly 80%, believe the use of AI should be explicitly disclosed. Now, in Vilnius, I happen to stay at a hotel that's called the Shakespeare Hotel, and every room was named after the greats. I don't see a day 100 years from now where those rooms are going to be named after great LLMs. And the reason for that is I think there's a natural cultural bias for rewarding the human beings who are truly the creators and the lifeblood, excuse me, of our creative community. So does anyone here disagree that a work that is derived even from, let's say, licensed content, that the consumer shouldn't know that this was created by a machine versus an original creative work by human beings? Anybody disagree with that, or maybe technical issues I shouldn't look at? No different than Mr. Rao, me. I use Photoshop. I could create Corvette cap with a skateboard or surfboard really quickly. No different than I want that, which is, again, based on prior creative work, somehow have disclosures. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think the question and that we thought about, we think it's definitely of interest to our creative customers to be able to show something is human created versus AI created. And in Adobe Firefly, it all comes out saying something is AI created. That's on by default, so you'll always know that it's AI created. The trick going forward, though, is we anticipate our AI features are our most popular features in Photoshop. Mm-hmm. So we expect going forward, most images are going to have a part that is AI and a part that is human. Mm-hmm. And you have to start thinking about what are you disclosing when you disclose that, right? The content credential we mentioned before that you could use a do not train tag for, you could use for addressing deepfakes, also will record the human part versus the AI part. So you could think about using that as a disclosure, but I'm not sure over time people are going to be as interested as knowing the identity of the artist who created the work as opposed to like which part of it they did with AI. Which
That's fair. Professor Sag, did you have a comment?
Just to follow up on that, you also have to think that you're not just talking visual works here. Like take the same thing with written works. Someone uses GPT to help smooth over their writing, refine something, explain it more clearly. There are some awkward line drawing questions. But the spirit of the disclosure requirement is correct. The implementation, I think, just will be difficult.
I agree. Mr. Chair, I am checking the votes. I think it is probably time for us to wrap up the committee. I think you could see from this, just by the sheer number of members who came to the subcommittee, this is an area of interest and a priority for us. Mr. Chair, I have decided that maybe for the next hearing, it's going to take a little bit more tuning for me to get the answer, but I'm going to do with the, you know the song, Who Let the Dogs Out? I was thinking we'd set that to Don't Steal My IP, and I'll see if I can get that done. If you think about it, it'd be pretty snappy, but I'll work on that for those who may have to get a bigger room if people know about that in advance. But
we may end up doing this as a duet.
But I think this committee has demonstrated that we're very thoughtful and we are very diligent. And I, for one, could sit at that table and probably present the interest of either side of the spectrum, which is why I believe that we need legislative certainty. We need to learn, like data privacy, data ownership in Europe. They don't always get it right in the first tranche, so we wouldn't necessarily lift something up and implement it here. We want to think it through and make sure it's something that scales properly. But this is clearly an area where I don't think anyone, they'd be hard-pressed to convince me that no action is required. And again, my bias on this committee from the beginning, having grown up in innovation, technological innovation, seeing the compelling numbers about how important it is to our economy and our culture, there's a lot of work to do, and I'm confident with the leadership of the chair, we're going to get work done. We look forward to your continued engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Dillis. I think it was Mr. Brooks, I may be wrong, who early on said that other technological developments, perhaps it was you, Professor, word processing didn't end authorship, smartphones didn't end photography, but they impacted them. they impacted them. And we need to closely and with some deliberation realign what federal rights and protections there are, both to deal with things like deepfakes. Some argue that Shakespeare himself was a deepfake. To protect the rights of individuals, protect the rights of those who earn their living by being creative, to ensure that consumers understand what they're consuming, and to make sure that we're aligning with other countries that share our core values and our priority on a free market and the rights of individuals, in contrast to other countries with other systems. So I'm grateful to all of you for testifying today, for taking your time and contributing to this. These are very challenging questions. Members can submit questions for the record for these witnesses if they were not able to attend. Questions for the record are due by 5 p.m. 1 week from today, July 19th. Again, thank you all. I look forward to your input as we try and craft a good legislative solution. With that, this hearing is adjourned.